My name is Jeet here. I'm a staff writer for The Nation magazine. I've written a fair amount of literary criticism for The Nation and many other publications. And I have a book of essays called Sweet Lechery, which is largely literary essays dealing with figures like Guy Davenport, Philip Roth, Margaret Atwood, Alice Munro, John Metcalf, and many others. This is my first foray into the world of BookTube, although I hope to do many other reviews on this channel. I'm doing this largely on the inspiration of Matt from Bookpilled, who has a great YouTube channel and also a Patreon. And his specialty is commentary on science fiction, particularly from the period of the early 20th century, the pulp era, into the new wave of the 1960s and 1970s. Although he extends far beyond that, but that's his main area of focus. And I've really come to love Matt's show. Science fiction of the 20th century is one of my passions. And the show has really reignited that by talking about writers that I've long loved, like Philip K. Dick and Ursula K. Le Guin, and showing, how much you can actually do with this format in terms of bringing literature to life. And so I want to give out a salute to Matt. And I hope that my efforts, if they will not match his level, are at least not unworthy of what he's achieved. So today, for the first foray, I want to talk about C.L. Moore, who was a science fiction writer of the early 20th century. She was born in 1911, started writing in 1933, and died in 1986. And to sell her right from the start, I will say about C.L. Moore that she was a writer who straddled many different branches of science fiction and excelled in all of them. She started as a writer in the tradition of weird fantasy, of very much influenced by H.P. Lovecraft, and quickly joined the circle of writers around Lovecraft, and wrote as well as any member of that circle, whether it was Lovecraft or Robert E. Howard. And then in the later 30s, she moved on to astounding science fiction, which was very different from the sort of horror, fantasy, mythological fiction of the Lovecraft crew, as was more what it called hard science fiction, a sort of rigorously extrapolative fiction that tried to obey the known laws of science. And she excelled there too. And the pages of Astounding wrote as well as any of the major figures of the golden age of that magazine. We're talking about people like Robert Heinlein and Isaac Asimov. And later in the and late 40s and early 90s, a new version of science fiction emerged in Galaxy magazine that was more interested in sort of social satire, science fiction as political commentary. And again, she excelled at that. And I would say her best work is at the level of people like Ted Sturgeon and Alfred Bester. So in the case of C.L. Moore, Catherine Moore, we're dealing with a writer who wrote in a diversity of range within the broad genre of science fiction and fantasy, and more than held her own, and impressively held her own as a woman. I mean, all of these magazines, whether we're talking about Weird Tales, Astounding, or Galaxy, were male-dominated magazines. And C.L. Moore is Catherine Moore, and she was a rare woman writer in this field, and brought, this is not just a biographical fact, but that allowed her to bring in certain perspective that was invaluable for genre, or these various genres. Now, just a quick, broad biographical outline. Moore, as I said, born 1911, was a sickly child, which was actually not uncommon in the sort of science fiction world. This is a sort of biographical trope that one often comes across. The child that stays at home, reads a lot, lives in their imagination. That seems to be a good background if you want to grow up to write science fiction. And she went to the Indiana University in 1929, which was unfortunately for her, the beginning of the Depression. I had to leave 2 years later. She did write fiction as an undergraduate, even at that very early age. It's a very proficient writing in a sort of fantasy vein with a kind of hard satirical edge. Now, having dropped out of school, she quickly went to business college, learned to type, got a job at a bank, and, weathered the Depression in that way. And the story she tells is that she wanted to practice her typing to keep her job, was doing sort of, the standard typing practices. The quick brown fox ran over the lazy fence, but then decided, well, she can also practice by trying to write. And she has a very interesting account of this. It's almost as if she was taken over by the typewriter. She says she surrendered myself to it. And this was among life's most luxurious moments, giving the story its head and just keep your fingers moving. They know where they're going. The fingers know where they're going. And so there's a kind of suggestion of a kind of mind meld between the human and the machine, and the fiction having a life of its own. I want to flag all these as key to kind of understanding her fiction, because this theme of machine human interface and machine human mind meld is very common, as is also this theme of surrender, the loss of identity in a larger identity. We'll return to that. So she sold her first story in 1933, Her Tales, and was a hit right from the start. The magazine editor apparently was so happy with it, he decided to take the day off because it was a great day that this story, which is called Shambleau, came in. And for years afterwards, in Weird Tales and elsewhere, C.L. Moore was referred to as the author of Shambleau. It was a very famous story. So she made a big splash right from the start and was noticed by the Lovecraft Circle, who wrote for Weird Tales and started a long correspondence with H.P. Lovecraft, on her end going to like 60,000 words over a few years. And Lovecraft, one does not normally think of him, despite his name, as a creature of love. But in her case, Lovecraft acted as a Cupid. Lovecraft had sent some photographs of graveyards to another member of his circle, a young writer named Henry Kuttner, who also wrote in the Lovecraft vein. And Lovecraft said, when you're done with these photos, send them off to C.L. Moore. So Kuttner did that and addressed a letter to Mr. C.L. Moore, and was quickly corrected. They had a correspondence and met, and in 1940 they married. Now, but they more than just married. They became collaborative writers together. Both had come out of the Weird Tales, and both were horror fiction. Both were moving into the realm of science fiction. They had an unusually close relationship, a kind of mind meld, and would often write under pseudonyms like Louis Paget. And the way they describe it is that, like one of them would start a story, leave it at the typewriter, and the other one would come and start take it up from there. And that subsequently they had a very hard time knowing who wrote which stories or who wrote which parts of which stories. They had really like merged, and this actually eventually caused some anxiety for them, like the question of who am I? Am I C.L. Moore? Am I Henry Kuttner? Am I this third imaginary creature, Louis Paget? Now, but they were very successful as writers and doing quite well. Later in the 50s, they had enough money that they were both decided to go back to university and take up their truncated education. Henry Kuttner tragically died young of a heart attack in 1958. C.L. Moore continued to write, but not fiction. She would write television scripts, but basically gave up the science fiction writing after the death of Henry Kuttner. And she continued to live until 1986. But her giving up the writing raises all sorts of questions in terms of, I think her writing life had become so intertwined with her husband, her first husband, and that became such a part of her identity that I don't know if she had a writing identity, at least in terms of prose fiction, apart from Henry Kuttner. It was a great loss. I mean, for both Henry Kuttner's death and C.L. Moore, because they were both terrific writers. So in talking about C.L. Moore, I think the place to start is this collection from 1970, Best of C.L. Moore. It's part of a series of books that were done at that time of the best of various science fiction writers, story collections, like, the best of Fritz Leiber, the best of Frederick Pohl, the best of Henry Kuttner. And of this series, I think the best of C.L. Moore really stands out. I think it's actually an exceptionally well-edited book, and it's actually much better, to be frank, than the best of Henry Kuttner, which largely consists of collaborations between the two of them, but has many weaker stories. In the best of C.L. Moore, I'll say almost all the stories are top-notch. And also, as you read them, they're done chronologically, you can get a sense of her progression as a writer. And there's a real kind of story that emerges. So the first story is her first published professional work, which is Shambleau. And this is a kind of science fiction horror story, very influenced, as all her early work was, by Lovecraft. It introduces the character Northwest Smith, who can be described as a kind of proto-Han Solo. He's a smuggler, a roguish character, wears a leather jacket, quick with the gun, able to win over the ladies, not quite moral or ethical, but can be convinced to be so. And that's actually a kind of type of character that became very common in the 20s and 30s, growing out of, I think, the sort of disillusionment of World War One. One sees it in the sort of characters of Dashiell Hammett's Sam Spade or Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe, the various characters of Hemingway, the sort of characters that Humphrey Bogart would play, the hardened cynic. And Han Solo is very much of that tradition, but the hardened cynic with a heart of gold. And the other thing to say about Shambleau is that it's a planetary romance, which is a specific type of science fiction. It's a story type of fiction written by Edgar Rice Burroughs in his John Carter of Mars novels, or Lee Brackett, who also wrote Mars novels. And all these novels kind of had a shared universe of the solar system. It's the solar system has been colonized, but it also has a lot of pre-existing humanoid creatures. It's a very densely populated solar system with the sort of Mars having its canals and its old dying civilizations. Venus commonly being a jungle, hot sweat house. And people living on the moons of Jupiter. And now, obviously, from our point of view, this is not the way the solar system was. And I think even in the 1920s and 30s, there's enough scientific knowledge. This is a very sort of popular type of science fiction, almost more fantasy than science fiction. The other aspect of Shambleau, along with the other Northwest myth stories, is it has an element of horror. It basically is the prototype of the other Northwest Smith stories in the sense that it has the common template of the plot. Northwest Smith runs into a woman who's in trouble, often an exotic alien woman with a different skin color, very mysterious, helps her out, but then he gets entrapped in some sort of mind meld. It turns out that the people he's helping or the people he runs into have sort of vampiric power. And there's often like kind of an undercurrent of mythology in the case of Shambleau of the Medusa story. And this is also a running theme of Lovecraftian fiction. That's to say, the continuity between mythology and science, the idea that like what were myths of old will be verified by science. So it has all these elements. I think what makes it come alive is that it's, the quality of the writing. Like right from the start, she is able to create atmosphere and mood and has that Lovecraftian ability to convey horror, the exotic, the bizarre, the things that baffle the mind. But what is new in her work is something that you don't see in Lovecraft, which is this element of romanticism. And you don't see it in other Lovecraftian writers like Robert E. Howard. I think in the case of Lovecraft, it is always the cosmic horror of the universe that crushes the soul. In the case of Howard, it is the hero that is able to defeat the horror, and it's a wish fulfillment fantasy of manly power. In the case of Northwest Smith and other characters created by C.L. Moore, there's not so much the horror is there, but the horror is also combined with a sense of enticement, seduction. The horror, the alien is both exotic and has something ravishingly beautiful about it. And this sets her apart. And she brought a kind of emotional range to Lovecraftian fiction that wasn't there. I mean, there was already emotion in Lovecraftian fiction in the sense of in Lovecraft horror, Robert E. Howard, wish fulfillment, the sense of power, your Conan, you have your sword. But what she brought was really, the feeling of falling in love, losing yourself. And in the case of Shambleau, this sort of ambiguity about love, like the fact that you're submitting yourself and losing your identity, and that what is both enticing is also soul destroying or troubling. Now, the second story in the Best of C.L. Moore, Black Thirst, is another Northwest Smith story. And this is the one place I disagree with the editing of the book, because I think that Shambleau is really all you need. I mean, I think you can read all the Northwest Smith stories with entertainment, but they are kind of samey. They kind of follow the same template. And I would actually not recommend reading them. They are collections. I would recommend reading them all at once. Take a break of a month or two, and I think you can enjoy them. The third story, though, is something else again. It is, again, Lovecraftian in the sense that you have a character, Dexter, who's taken into this alien universe, has to meet this kind of cosmic god and work intersection with a sort of priestess who's an alien creature given human form, but the main character, Dexter, knows that she is not really human. And in fact, as the text says, she's not really a she. It's not, boy meets girl. It's boy meets, cosmic, horrific alien that is not along the traditional lines of gender, but they fall in love. And the whole story hinges on their love and how this cosmic horror god deals with their love. Now, there's not, I said, Lovecraft, not a lot of love in Lovecraft. He was misnamed. I would also say not a lot of craft, but in C.L. Moore, there is love, but love within this Lovecraftian template. And I think one way to think about her and Lovecraft is to bring in early 20th century cultural critic. And this might seem like way out of bounds, but there's a fellow named Ernst Bloch, who was a German writer, Marxist in the tradition of the Frankfurt School. And he wrote a famous book called Hope is the Principle and developed a philosophy of hope. His, major achievement was, unlike philosophers who had dealt with the world in the past and as was, he introduced this element of the fact that there's always the novum, the new. And that actually makes him very interesting for science fiction and of the future. And one of the arguments that Ernst Bloch makes is that the new, both horror and hope share a commonality, that they're both based on anticipation, that the anxiety is the flip side of hopefulness. And I think actually one that can verify this by looking at Lovecraft and C.L. Moore, which are two writers working in the same vein, admired each other, influenced each other, but they're taking this common experience of anticipation and taking it down two very different roads. Lovecraft is the road of anxiety, of fear, of the annihilation of the self. And Moore is in the story, The Bright Illusion, and in other stories, the path of, of hope, of falling in love, of, again, having all the anxiety of the loss of the self, but of not being destroyed, but being reborn. And so that makes her a very interesting writer with what she did with the Lovecraftian tradition. Now, the fourth story in the Best of C.L. Moore is Black God's Kiss. And this is the first story of Jirel of Joiry. It's from four, again in Weird Tales. And Jirel of Joiry is the second major character that C.L. Moore created. Unlike Northwest Smith, who's set in the future in this prefabricated planetary romance, Jirel of Joiry is a sword and sorcery character living in a kind of 13th century France, not really historically well-grounded. She is a sort of chieftain, the Lady of Joiry, and a female Conan. And she, like Conan, has adventures fighting other warlords and also dark creatures, dark Lovecraftian creatures. I would say these stories are better than the Northwest Smith stories overall. Like, I think if I were to read a collection, I'd prefer to read Jirel of Joiry over a Northwest Smith collection. They have many of the virtues of the Conan story, of a sense of adventure, sword and sorcery, fighting, and also color, the colorful writing. Unlike the Conan stories, they're set in a sort of Christian moral universe, which makes a big difference. In the first story, Jirel of Joiry is kind of seeking revenge, and as part of her revenge, she goes into base hell. And in many of the stories, she goes into a kind of dark netherworld, demonic realm, and the state of her soul is very much part of what's at stake in the story, and that introduces a moral level. Whereas in the Conan story, I think there's a kind of pagan sense of honor, keeping your word. But I don't think the question of integrity of soul is quite there. And the other element is, again, this element of emotional engagement, the emotional stakes of love. In the first story, she is seeking revenge from a man who has violated her, but there's a real question, both the justice of the revenge and her own feelings about him, which make a kind of very troubling story. Certainly troubling from 20th century perspective, but 21st century perspective. But that is also a deeply felt story and a story that stays with you. With both the Northwest Smith stories and Jirel of Joiry, very much pulp stories where, there's the value of the writing is in color, the colorfulness, the purpleness, and it's often used as a term of abuse, purple prose. But I think there's purple and there's purple, and in her case, the sort of garishness, makes a kind of lovely hue. And I think these stories, despite being nearly a century old now, are very readable. The next story is from astounding science fiction, Tryst in Time. And the earlier story, Bright Illusion, also appeared in Astounding. This is the pre John W. Campbell Astounding. It's not doing hard science fiction, but it is science fiction. Tryst in Time, kind of has a Wellesian time machine and a sort of swashbuckling pulp hero. And in the course of his adventures through time, he's meeting variations of the same woman. And there's a kind of feeling of reincarnation. And again, the emotional destiny of the character, of whether they can eventually come together or not. So it's a time travel romance story. She moves closer to hard science fiction in 1939 with Greater Than Gods. Again, it's an astounding science fiction. There's a half fantasy, half science fiction. I mean, a lot of it, the story is about a character in the future who's faced with a dilemma. He's in love with two different women who are very different. One is a hard-headed scientist, and the other is a very girly girl socialite. And he's given a vision of the two paths. And he himself is also a scientist and involved with a technology of choosing gender. And what the story becomes is a fable about gender identity and gender polarization. The male, if she goes with the hard-headed woman, he'll have male kids, and there's a kind of male future that's interestingly almost a critique of Campbellian science fiction. John W. Campbell's view that the future humanity will be like America. It'll conquer the frontier, conquer and beat all the aliens. And this is the future, but it's presented in the story as a kind of like fascistic nightmare. Like there'll be human scientific conquest, but at the loss of civilizational values. Conversely, if he goes with the girly girl, he'll have female children, and there'll be a kind of female future where humanity enjoys culture but abandons science and falls into decadence. And I won't spoil the story, but it is really about this issue of gender binary, what happens when you have two polarized views of gender, and what are the possibilities of overcoming that and combining the two. And here again, I mean, I don't think C.L. Moore's position as a female writer in a largely male genre can be ignored. There's another aspect of this, since we're talking about gender, that's perhaps worth bringing up, which is that she wrote under the name C.L. Moore up until this point of the late 1930s. And she said she did this because she worked at a bank and, was fearful of losing her job in the Depression. And that's true. It's also the case that, many female writers use pseudonyms or use their initials for fear of offending male readers. And as we mentioned, her first husband, Henry Kuttner, initially thought she was a man. So, there's a lot of sort of gender ambiguity that's running through this. The next story in the collection, Fruit of Knowledge, is a return to fantasy. It is a retelling of the Genesis story. We all, Adam, Eve, and the serpent, but with the additional character of Lilith, who is a character in Hebrew storytelling, purportedly Adam's first wife. And the story, again, takes up issues of gender and of sexual identity in a relationship, of losing your identity, and what does it mean to be in this couple relationship. Uses Lilith to both critique the sort of traditional Genesis story and raise questions, like about what sort of autonomy or freedom is capable in a patriarchy, especially with the ultimate patriarch, Hova. And I was a bit surprised at this story. I mean, a lot of writers have played with Lilith. I played with the Book of Genesis, but I wasn't expecting a pulp fiction magazine from 1940 from doing so. So it's very interesting that both she was aware of Lilith and she was able to be so bold. And the other aspect I would say about that, the other aspect of her use of the Lilith story is that this is again Lovecraftian. A lot of the sort of Lovecraft tradition, and one sees this also in Robert E. Howard, is like taking traditional stories of Atlantis or Merlin and trying to fictionalize them and imagine them as pulp narratives. So she's still very much working in that vein. And a further example of that is the next story, Daemon, 1946, about this Portuguese fellow who's seen as a simpleton and who has these visions of angels and demons and the great god Pan, and interacts with these magical, mythical creatures, which no one else can see because humanity has developed science. And he's the kind of the last person that is in touch with the sort of mythological world. Very good story. And as with Fruit of Knowledge, very proficient. By this point, and she's writing in collaboration with Henry Kuttner at this point. But I think that thematically, these are all C.L. Moore stories. She's she's moved beyond sort of the colorfulness of pulp and has a very strong, sure sense of narrative and is a much pithier writer and can really carry the reader along. Another story in the sort of science fiction vein is No Women Born. From Astounding Science Fiction, 1944, which is a kind of female Frankenstein story. It involves a dancer in the future who's like a worldwide celebrity, loses her body in a terrible accident, has a doctor who does experimental work with cybernetics. It's one of the first cyborg stories. And, is able to mix her mind with machines. And the whole question is, both how she can regain her career as a musician, as an actor, which is a humanistic thing, which requires contact with human experience and human life, which she has this mechanical body, but then also how humans feel about this new cyborg creature. And the text is very knowingly in the tradition of Frankenstein. There's allusions to Frankenstein in it, and very kind of sophisticated, and also dealing, I think, with the idea of gender as performance. That this is really like a mechanical woman, but has a sort of cultural knowledge of what it's expected to be a woman, and uses that to move her mechanical body in ways that are enticing to men. And so she's not a woman, but also a woman. These are sort of the questions that are already came up, as early as The Bright Illusion, um, and Greater Than God. Like, what does the gender binary mean? How much is it real? And what does it mean to fall in love with something that is not the traditional emblem of the other gender? The final story is Vintage Season, which is an all-time classic of science fiction. And I came to it because it was much praised by people like Robert Silverberg and Barry Meldberg, science fiction writers I highly prize, and they were always praising it. Silverberg wrote a kind of sequel to Vintage Season, not quite a sequel. It's taking the same story, but told from the point of view of other characters. So it's a time travel story. It creates this idea, I think she was the first to do it, of time travel as a form of tourism. It's set in a near future, which is a sort of like set what would the 1950s or 1960s would be like a sort of technological America where things are booming, but the time travelers are from an even future America or future world where there had been a huge catastrophe and then humanity rebuilt, came up with time travel, and now time travelers like to go back in the past and basically are kind of disaster tourists, not dissimilar to the people we now see on YouTube who go to a place like Chechnya and witness horrors. And the story is partially about the sort of discrepancy between the wealthy people who are decadent and use tourism to sort of revel in suffering that they are separate from. Very interesting, both as an idea and explored very proficiently by having the main character or the point of view character being a figure of the present of the novel, doesn't know about time travel. It slowly gets a dawning or an inkling of what is going on, and horror, again, the sort of horror, but it's also sexually attracted to one of the time travelers. And again, this is the sort of common theme of the fusion of love and hate, the way in which, what we desire also repels us. It's a wonderfully told story. It still has pulp elements, and um, John Updike once reviewed a collection of science fiction that had this story, and he kind of pointed out that some of the sentences were a little too pushy, and like not John Updike reviewed the story when it was republished in an anthology of science fiction, and had a critique of some of the prose as a little bit too pulpy, and I think that's true. But again, it is good pulp. It carries you along. The theme of time travel comes up in some of her other work as well. There's a story she wrote with Henry Kuttner, Mimsy Were the Bargraves, which when I talk about the best of Henry Kuttner, we'll get into. And earlier in this collection, we saw Tryst in Time. And I think that a recurring part of her interest in time travel is this idea of sort of juxtaposition of one culture with another. And what happens, in Mimsy Were the Bargraves, when sort of the educational toys of the future meet the children of the present. That this is, again, the encounter with the alien, the encounter with the thing that is baffling, is Lovecraftian, has an element of horror, but also allows you to transcend yourself and become something different. And so, again, this is a sort of thematic concern that runs through all her work. The other aspect I would say about the tourism theme in Vintage Season is I was thinking about this story as a story from 1946. And that's a period where, Europe had been ravaged, Asia had been ravaged, Africa had been ravaged. And the United States, even though it participated in the Second World War, was starting a boom, was starting this sort of great post-war prosperity, and was like much better off than the rest of the world. And so there was a kind of weird temporal juxtaposition between America and the rest of the world. And in some ways, I feel like part of the undercurrent of the story is this feeling of, being a privileged American and realizing that, if you travel to a place like Europe, you're actually going to do quite well. Your dollar's worth a lot. You come from a healthy free society, and that you're becoming an almost in this new world a tourist in other people's misery. And again, I think that's an theme that points to the sort of emotional potency that is in so many of these stories. So if you look at the best of C.L. Moore as a whole, you really see a progression of her as a writer, moving from Lovecraftian horror to astounding science fiction, extrapolative science fiction, and then in Vintage Season, the element of sort of social and political critique. And you also see a writer that is advancing. She starts off very strong. Shambleau remains one of her most beloved stories, but her prose, her ability to pace stories, it improves as she goes along. Many of these stories are long on the longer side. They're more novellas rather than short stories. And she was a master in the novella, and that's a kind of a middle form between the short story and the novel. I think short stories are often like almost like poems. They're like perfect gem-like things where every word is in place. And the novel is a more raggy monster, which allows you to have a scope of covering social life. And I think the interesting thing about the novella is that it kind of tries to do both. It tries to have some of the scope of the novel of, suggesting a social world, many different types of characters, but also the sort of linguistic precision of the short story. And I think, within the realm of science fiction, she achieved some of the best that can be done in the novella form. And like other masters of the novella are people like Herman Melville and Joseph Conrad. And I think that they also use the novella in this way of trying to, like have both a heightened sense of language and a sort of wide-ranging plot. And she really, in Vintage Season, it really is an incredibly powerful novella with like a wide scope of both the present or, the near future and the far future, and characters of very different types, and an emotional story about, bafflement, erotic attraction, erotic repulsion, and as long combined with a broader sort of social critique of decadence and of the sort of sadistic thrill of enjoying other people's misery. So it's, like justifiably considered a classic. Now, the best of C.L. Moore, as I mentioned, came out in the mid 70s. You can only buy it now through antiquarian book dealers. You have to go on A-Books or try to search through that way. I would recommend the search. I have learned that there's a new C.L. Moore collection that's in the works, and I will revisit C.L. Moore when that comes out and let people know about it. But I highly recommend her into sort of science fiction and also Lovecraftian horror from the early 20th century. She is like one of the peak writers of the period, and both her work and her work in collaboration with Henry Kuttner remains incredibly valuable. And unlike much of the work of that era, I don't think it's dated that much. And in some ways, as I've tried to suggest throughout this talk, many of her themes are actually like incredibly relevant now in our age of sort of gender fluidity and questioning of the idea of gender. And, one can always have issues with her. I think in Shambleau, there's a kind of racial stereotyping that can be sort of questioned. But on the whole, I mean, this is not work that is dated. It has the true quality of the classic, which is that it actually seems fresher now than it did at the time that it was first published. It actually seems to speak to us in ways that I'm not quite sure that it necessarily spoke to people who originally read these stories in the 1930s and 40s. So again, look up C.L. Moore. Thank you.